Everyone. So today we are going to talk about a very big question, a question that philosophers adamantly disagree about, and a question that's very hard to answer, but I'm going to do my best shot. So today our question is, what is philosophy? So maybe obviously, philosophy is a field of study. It's, in some ways has things in common with other fields of study like physics, biology, psychology, English, math, etc. So when it comes to a field of study, I think there's sort of two main ways we can identify a field of study. The first is by its subject matter. So what does it study? What do philosophers study? What do physicists study? And then the second is by its methodology. So how is it studied? How do philosophers do philosophy research, or how do physicists learn new facts about physics? So here's some examples of this distinction. Physics, for example, the subject matter of physics is stuff about what are the laws of nature, what's the nature of fundamental particles, and their main methodology is through doing scientific experiments. Biology studies organisms, but also its methodology is experimental. Math studies mathematical objects like numbers, functions, figures, shapes, matrices, etc. But unlike physics and biology's, math methodology is non-experimental. So mathematicians will, do things like, for example, with a mathematical proof would be an example of a mathematical methodology. So I think this actually raises a really interesting question, and it's a question that I get a lot. Because, in part, philosophy also has a non-experimental methodology. And the question that I think is interesting is, how can we study something without doing experiments? I actually got this question a lot because I worked for a year as a postdoc where my main job was to do philosophical research. And I didn't wake up every morning and go into a lab and start doing some experiments. It looked very different than that. And so I think a lot of people would ask me the question, like, what are you even doing? Like, how can you study something if you're not doing experiments? And so I think this points to a super, super important distinction that I think people interested in philosophy should definitely be aware of. And the answer to this question is that philosophy largely involves a way of knowing that's called a priori. Okay. What is a priori? Well, something is known a priori if it's known independently of experience. So, some examples. Tautologies are a priori. A equals A is a priori. You might hear people say it is what it is. That's actually a tautology. Mathematical truths are known a priori. So 1 + 1 = 2. We can know that independently of going out into the world and doing some experiment. A lot of people think we can know things like torturing babies for fun is morally wrong. We can know that without doing an experiment or actually torturing a baby or something like that. Another thing that I think a lot of people think we could know a priori is things that are true by definition. So a bachelor is an unmarried man. Not all of these are going to be agreed on by everyone, so some of these examples would be controversial, but I think a lot of people think these are the type of things we could know a priori. So knowing a priori contrasts with another way of knowing. It's also known as a posteriori, and I think it's very similar to what's meant by empirical knowledge. And these are things that are known by experience. They're known by going out in the world and making observations or doing experiences or even just perceiving or sensing things about the world. So scientific knowledge is a posteriori. So for example, electrons have a negative charge. That's something we discovered by studying the world. It's known by experience. Historical knowledge, Washington was born in 1723. That's not something we could just sit in our armchair and think about and say, oh yeah, Washington was born in 1723. No, that's a fact about the world, something that's known by experience. And in this case, for most of us, it's known by testimony of others who experienced it. There's a brown table in front of me. It's a really basic a posteriori piece of knowledge. My brother had avocado toast for breakfast. Again, not something I can know independently of some kind of experience. Okay, So in most disciplines, I mean, maybe not most, but a lot of disciplines, such as physics, biology, psychology, etc., our learning, our knowledge is not a priori. It's not known independently of experience. But what's interesting about math and philosophy is that they're both largely known a priori. Um, this might not hold for all topics in philosophy. I know less about math, but there's this thing we're going to talk about later that's called experimental philosophy. That's actually you're trying to make progress on philosophical questions by doing experiments. So it is an empirical way of knowing. So that might be an example of philosophy that's not a priori. So I'm not necessarily claiming 100% of philosophy is always a priori, but I do think it's generally true that philosophy is mostly done or largely done a priori. Okay, so that's a little bit about the methodology of philosophy. Now we're going to turn to this second aspect. So we said disciplines have two aspects. They have methodology, which is how are things known, and then the subject matter, which is like, what is it about? What are the things we're trying to know? So I think a really good place to start when it comes to the question of the subject matter of philosophy is this website. It's called philpapers.org. Basically what philpapers is it's an attempt to categorize philosophical research. And so they have 6 main topics, which are then divided into topics, which are divided into topics, which are divided into topics. It's actually a huge website. If you're interested in philosophy, you don't know about it, I highly recommend you go check it out. I think it's really helpful. But as you can see, I guess my circle's a little off here, but here's the 6 main topics that Philpapers divides philosophy into. The first is metaphysics and epistemology. The second is value theory, which includes things like ethics and political philosophy. The third is philosophy of science, math, and logic. The fourth is the history of Western philosophy. And then the fifth is other philosophical traditions, which includes Eastern philosophy. And then they have like a miscellaneous category for things like introductions or papers about teaching philosophy, like the best way to teach, in a philosophy classroom, stuff like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about and focus on the first 5 topics and just dive into each in a little bit more detail so we can kind of get a sense of what is philosophy about? What's the subject matter of philosophy? Okay, so the first general topic is metaphysics and epistemology. Some people would consider this to be one of the core topics in philosophy, although that is controversial. But let's start with metaphysics and epistemology and then some things that those branch into. So epistemology, which is actually my area of specialization, is the study of knowledge and rational belief. And I think we can divide epistemology into 3 main topics. The first is traditional epistemology, which looks at the question like, what is knowledge? How common is knowledge? Can we know lots of things or almost nothing? And then also the question, what should we believe? There's also social epistemology, which is questions about when we should believe a testifier, disagreement, how we should respond to experts. And then there's formal epistemology, which tries to model belief as something like probabilities, and then asks philosophical questions about what would make that rational. Bayesianism is a very common kind of formal epistemology. Then there's metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of the nature and structure of reality. Some common fields within metaphysics is ontology, which is the study of existence, modality, which is the study of possibility, and there's a ton of other topics in metaphysics. You can check out the Philpapers link under metaphysics for all of them, but here's some of them. Personal identity, time, abstract objects, like numbers and propositions, causation. And then there's also social metaphysics. And I guess I should say too that some of these topics, so like social metaphysics would be like the nature of groups, the nature of race and gender. Some of these are going to overlap with others because later we're also going to talk about social philosophy and the philosophy of race and gender. So some topics sort of fit into more than one of these categories. And also these lists are not exhaustive. I'm just kind of picking out some key examples, but under each of these topics, there's like a lot more stuff. We just don't have time to talk about all of it here. Okay, so some fields of philosophy that I think are related to metaphysics and epistemology, but distinct and often studied on their own would be philosophy of language, which is the study of the meaning and reference of language, syntax, etc. There's philosophy of mind, which is the study of mental states. So questions about consciousness, intentionality, which is what it means for something to be about something else, perception, the relationship between the mental and the physical, how we know about mental states. And I'll just stop here. So I have LEMM. It's actually like an elementary school apparently. But if you hear LEMMN in a philosophy context, that means language, epistemology, metaphysics, and mind, which very controversially, some people would say are core areas of philosophy. The other picture is M&E. And if you hear that in a philosophical context, that often means metaphysics and epistemology. So just so you know. There's a few more topics. So metaphilosophy is an important topic. That's actually what this video is about. So it's philosophical questions about philosophy. What is philosophy? Can there be philosophical progress? Stuff like that. There's philosophy of action, which is the study of agency, autonomy, intention, free will, reasons, and reasoning. Some philosophy of action might overlap with metaphysics because metaphysics also concerns questions about free will. And then some of it might actually overlap with ethics, which we're going to talk about in a second, especially like reasons and reasoning. And then there's philosophy of religion, which is another area that I specialize in. Such a great definition, the philosophical study of religion. That's not very informative, but philosophy of religion includes the question of whether God exists, the question of the concept of God. So if God exists, what would God be like, or what are the various possibilities for what God would be like? And then also questions about the rationality of religious commitment. That could include religious belief, but also like religious practice. So that's kind of a lot of the main branches of metaphysics and epistemology, but again, this is not an exhaustive list. And on philosophy of religion, I should say, I actually did an entire video just as an introduction to the history and then the subject matter of philosophy of religion. So I'll link that in the description. If you're interested in philosophy of religion specifically, go check that out. Okay. The next main topic in philosophy is what's known as value theory or axiology. So there's kind of three main branches of ethics, but then some other topics that are also considered part of value theory. So the first column will be sort of about these three main branches of ethics. The first is applied ethics. This involves sort of practical moral questions that we'll ask in everyday life. So, is abortion wrong? Is polluting the environment permissible? Do animals have rights? That's applied ethics. Then there's normative ethics. Normative ethics is a little bit more abstract, and what normative ethics tries to do is construct theories that account for the rightness or wrongness of certain actions. So, for example, is an action right or wrong because of its consequences? That's known as consequentialism. Or is it right or wrong because it conforms to a certain rule or set of rules? That's known as deontology. Or is it right or wrong because a virtuous agent would perform it or not perform it? That's known as virtue ethics. So those are the three main kinds of of normative ethics, although there's other kinds as well. And then there's an even more abstract kind of ethics that's called meta-ethics. So this kind of involves fundamental, really abstract questions about morality, such as, are moral truths objective or subjective? Are they independent of minds or are they dependent on human minds? How do we know about morality? What's our source of moral knowledge? What is the nature of morality? So those are sort of the three main kinds of ethics. Each one is more abstract than the previous, but there's also some other parts of value theory as well. So there's social and political philosophy, which is the philosophical study of groups and governments. This concerns topics such as equality, rights, democracy, war, and liberty. And there's philosophy of law related to especially political philosophy that, concerns the nature of the law, legal reasoning, legal authority, etc. And there's philosophy of race and gender. This is arguably where feminist philosophy would fall. There's also the philosophy of sex and gender and the philosophy of race. It involves questions about social construction, sexual orientation, and then reproductive and sexual ethics, among other things. So these are just some examples. And then there's aesthetics, which is the study of art, beauty, and taste. So that's value theory. So we've talked about metaphysics and epistemology, and then value theory. Now we'll move to sort of the third category, which is the philosophy of science, logic, and math. Okay, so we'll start with philosophy of science. There's a lot of subcategories under philosophy of science, So first is the general philosophy of science, which involves questions about the scientific method, scientific theories, scientific laws, and then one big debate is realism versus anti-realism. Do our scientific theories actually describe the world as it is, or do they sort of serve some other, maybe a pragmatic purpose? Then there's like philosophical studies of specific areas within science. So, for example, philosophy of biology, philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of physics, philosophy of psychology. And there's also the philosophy of probability. This overlaps with formal epistemology, so you could probably categorize it in either place, but a lot of times that's considered a part of philosophy of science. Okay, then we have logic and math. So there's logic or philosophy of logic. Logic is the study of what follows from what. I actually have a whole video where I do a basic introduction to logic, so I'll also link that if that's helpful. This is also known as entailment. This includes classical logic, quantifier logic, modal logic, higher order logic, non-classical logics, paradoxes in the history of logic. I don't have time here to go into all of those, but check out that logic video if you're interested. At least there I cover the basics of logic, and then I talk about quantifier and modal logic as well. Then there's philosophy of math, involving the study of like mathematical truths, like what grounds mathematical truths. That might overlap some with metaphysics, although some philosophers of math might not like me saying that. The study of mathematical proofs, mathematical evidence, mathematical practice. And then another big question is the relationship between logic and math. So there's debates about whether if one of those is more fundamental or maybe they're both equally fundamental. And then finally, there's the philosophy of computer science. And this is going to overlap with some of the other fields we've already talked about. But there's sort of questions about computer ethics and communication, artificial intelligence and the ethics of artificial intelligence, simulations, digital arts, philosophy of information, philosophy of social media and technology. So some of that will be questions like in epistemology, like how could we know that we're not in a simulation? Some of that would be questions in ethics, you know, the ethics of AI or the ethics of social media. So some of this will overlap with other fields, but you could kind of see philosophy of computer science is sort of falling under philosophy of science as well. Okay. So we're getting to a place where I think it's, you know, it's more controversial, or at least some people wouldn't consider these areas of philosophy as core as others. And part of it also depends on like how exactly you're doing these areas. I think these are types of philosophy, but some people would say that they're less core than some of the other ones that we've just talked about. So getting really controversial here, I think these are still types of philosophy. The first is the history of philosophy. So you can talk about the history of Western philosophy, which can be categorized, well, in many ways, but roughly there's ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, early modern philosophy, the history of analytic philosophy, 19th and 20th century philosophy. And then there's other philosophical traditions as well, including African philosophy, Asian philosophy, European philosophy, and the philosophy of the Americas, which involves indigenous philosophy, Latin American philosophy, and American pragmatism. And I think there's different ways of doing the history of philosophy. If you're doing the history of philosophy to try to kind of make progress on philosophical ideas, I think almost everyone would say, yeah, that's definitely philosophy. Where it gets more controversial is if you're mainly doing it to kind of interpret a certain thinker, figure out like what a certain thinker's views were. And I think some people would be more hesitant to consider that philosophy and would say that's more history. We're not necessarily going to be taking a stand on that here, but there's at least both of these ways of doing the history of philosophy. And I think that distinction can be helpful. Then there's also experimental philosophy, which we talked about a little bit already. Experimental philosophy basically uses empirical methods to try to make progress on philosophical questions. So you might test people's judgments or intuitions about various, subjects that we've talked about already. So morality or language or knowledge, God, free will, etc. And even though this isn't a priori, because it is using empirical methods, many consider it philosophy because it has the same subject matter as philosophy. So like we said, we have method and we have subject matter. So some people think as long as you're using, your subject matter is philosophical, you could be using a non-a priori method like an experiment, and that still count as philosophy. Others would maybe say empirical philosophy actually isn't philosophy, but it's some kind of science. So there's a debate to be had here. And whether experimental philosophy is controversial, but I think most people would say that it is philosophy. Okay, so the final distinction that I think is helpful that I want to touch on briefly is this distinction between sort of two methodologies within philosophy, or maybe two groups of philosophers. And that's the distinction between continental and analytic philosophers. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each. So continental philosophy has its roots on the continent of Europe. So France, Germany, Russia, other places on the main continent of Europe, and historically influential figures in continental philosophy include Hegel, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Husserl, others. The methodology of continental philosophy, you might say it's more like literature than it is like science. It kind of paints these general pictures of the world that some people would say are vague. When you hear the word postmodernism, that's that type of thinking is very influenced by continental philosophy. And also a lot of contemporary Western theology, I think, is very influenced by these continental thinkers. So the main complaint I think that analytic philosophers would make about continental philosophers, that continental philosophers would make about analytic philosophers is they would say analytic philosophy is too disconnected from human experience, and continental philosophy is trying to paint these pictures of the world that connect to everyday human experiences. So I know that was quick, but hopefully when I contrast that with analytic philosophy, it'll be more clear how the two relate. So analytic philosophy is traditionally taught and written in English-speaking countries, and it has its roots in the British empiricists, such as Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, and also the logical positivists like A.J. Ayres, Carnap, and Quine. So these are the people you'll read if you take a course or study the history of analytic philosophy. You'll often start with the logical positivists, but maybe also you'll talk about the British empiricists as well. So analytic philosophy is more like science than it is like literature. It strives to be very clear about language, so defining its terms, putting arguments in standard form where the premises are each on their own line and numbered, and then the conclusion is written on its own line after the premises. And then in each of those statements, you try to be really clear about what those words mean. Analytic philosophy can be really specific, so you'll take like a very specific question, maybe in ontology, you'll look at you just try to make specific progress by going slowly and being really clear. So the main complaint analytic philosophers would make about continental philosophy is that it's not clear. They're using words in ways, but not being clear about what those words mean. And then, like I said, the analytic philosophers would come back and say, well, you're doing this thing that's disconnected from human experience. So I am more of an analytic philosopher, but I think it's good to sort of step back and give people both sides. So hopefully that's helpful, at least as a basic introduction to the distinction between the two types of philosophy. A lot of the things that we've been talking about, you can do in a more continental way, or you can do in a more analytic way. So metaphysics and epistemology, you could do them in a more continental way or more analytic way, for example. Okay, so let's review what we've covered today. We've talked about the two aspects of a field of study, which is its subject matter and its methodology. Then we've talked about the methodology of philosophy. It's largely done a priori. The subject matter of philosophy, which we've talked about in more detail, but just to summarize, it includes metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, philosophy of science, logic, history of philosophy. And then we've talked about the distinction between continental and analytic philosophy. So here's some further resources. If you're interested, philpapers.org, like I mentioned, like a huge database of like almost every single philosophy article that's been written and categorizes them in a very helpful way. So if you're like, I'm interested in metaphysics, you can click on that and then see the topics and you're like, okay, I'm interested in ontology, then you can see the topics within that. So it's a really helpful categorization and also just gives you an introduction to kind of the main fields of philosophy. And then another thing I'm going to recommend, and I'll put this in the description as well, is it's a Philosophy Bites podcast. So this is a philosophy podcast, and they interview professional philosophers, and they, I think without warning, asked a bunch of these people the question, what is philosophy? And it's really interesting to kind of hear their answers, and some of them just kind of laugh because it is a really hard question to answer, but they kind of compiled all of those into about a 20-minute audio clip. So I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And then again, I did an interview with Finding Truth, which is another YouTube channel on philosophy of religion. So I will also link that in the description, and I go into the history and then topics of philosophy of religion in more detail.